In the 1800s, the promise of opportunity brought immigrants to America. In China, rapid population growth led to increased poverty and overcrowding. Over time, tension increased with the anti-Chinese because the Chinese were cheap labor, mainly in California. Senator John F. Miller of California introduced a bill to the U.S. Congress going towards what the anti-Chinese wanted, creating the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. It forbade Chinese immigration into the U.S. The Chinese Exclusion Act was passed in order to keep the white racial purity and to meet the anti-Chinese workers' demands. There were still some Chinese immigrants living in the U.S. even after the Exclusion Act was passed, granting their relatives U.S. citizenships too. However, some Chinese immigrants found a way around the Exclusion Act, faking their American relatives to enter the U.S. Once the act expired, the U.S. Congress extended the Chinese Exclusion Act in the form of the Geary Act. The Chinese Exclusion Act was the very first significant law restricting immigration into the U.S. The Naturalization Act of 1790 was passed, denying the citizenships and freedom for non-white people. In effect, the nation was divided into two parts, the white population and racial minorities. Racial minorities would be limited to their citizenship, voting, family rights, etc. In 1846, the very first U.S. armed conflict started, the Mexican-American War. War started because the United States declined to incorporate Texas into the Union, mostly because the Northerners were against the addition of the new slave state. The war ended in 1848, and by the time the war was over, Mexico had lost about one-third of their territory. Those included present-day Utah, California, Nevada, Arizona, and New Mexico. In the same year, gold was discovered by James W. Marshall in California, creating a bigger opportunity for immigrants. Soon after gold was discovered, many people were immigrating from China, Germany, Chile, Mexico, Ireland, Turkey, and France, more than 90% of them being male. Many Chinese families immigrated from China because of famine, overcrowding, and poverty. They also immigrated to the U.S. because of factory work jobs, agriculture jobs, and mining gold. They viewed the United States as a land of opportunity. When the immigrants first arrived, they were well received and were treated pleasantly. Since they were cheap labor, many employers wanted to hire them. They worked for only a fraction of the money that a white worker would be paid. The Chinese would not quit their job despite their low wages, bringing anti-Chinese thoughts to the white workers. After a while of working, they were successful enough to open their own businesses and create Chinatowns. However, they were considered as coolie laborers, meaning unskilled native laborers. Central Pacific recruited them to build the California Central Railroad in 1858. There were still some white workers working on it too. It was finished on October 13, 1861, but after the Chinese started to come to America, they caused unemployment to native-born Americans. The Americans attributed unemployment and declining wages to Chinese workers so they would be viewed as racially lower ranking. California tried to legally prohibit Chinese Mongolian immigration the same year the Transcontinental Railroad was being built, but was unsuccessful. On the bright side, the West had accomplished mmany things because of them. Soon enough, however, people were becoming poor and unemployed, causing great tension. The Americans accused the Chinese for stealing their jobs. They had discussed their issues and had meetings about the Chinese and wanting to exclude them. Anti-Chinese riots started like the Chinese massacre of 1871, led by Dennis Kearny, when a mob of white men entered Chinatown to murder, rob, and attack the Chinese. There were about 17 through 20 deaths, and it took place in Los Angeles on October 24, 1871. 3 years before that, the Burlingame-Seward Treaty was made, part of it saying that either nation would be open to unlimited immigration from other. On May 6, 1882, a compromise was introduced to the U.S. Congress by Senator John F. Miller, the act being called the Chinese Exclusion Act. The Chinese Exclusion Act was passed in the U.S. Congress and signed into law by President Chester A. Arthur. It nearly ended the Chinese immigration for almost a century. The Chinese Exclusion Act was the very first and only significant law created that suspended immigration for the U.S. In this case, the law only prohibited Chinese laborers because they overpopulated American jobs. Also, it contradicted naturalization to the Chinese immigrants. This law lasted for 10 years. Whereas, in the opinion of the government of the United States, the coming of Chinese laborers in this country endangers the good order of certain localities within the territory thereof, is the very first line of the act, meaning that the Chinese laborers affect to the U.S. negatively. It also says in Section 14 that hereafter no state court or court of the United States shall admit Chinese to citizenship, and all laws in conflict of this act are hereby repealed. The following amendments, like the Geary Act, prevented Chinese laborers who had already left the country from coming back. The native-born Americans finally got what they wanted, and less problems were caused between them and the Chinese immigrants. The Chinese Exclusion Act was a major problem for immigrants who tried to enter the U.S. Because of this act, they could not make a better profit for themselves and their family. As for the immigrants already in the U.S., this act did not negatively impact the Chinese men, but the entire society of America. The economic health of the nation dwindled. After the Exclusion Act passed, stricter acts had passed. One saying that already existed: Chinese communities being restricted. Since there were a lot of Chinese immigrants, they were the ones who opened many businesses and created Chinatowns. Without them and their businesses, many lives were ruined. For the Chinese, they lost their progress in America. Everything that they had worked for ever since they immigrated to America was destroyed. As for the American citizens, the anti-Chinese got what they wanted: the elimination of the Chinese. However, not all non-Chinese were wanting the elimination of the Chinese laborers. This letter is an example of persuasion and protest towards the U.S. Congress and the President, saying that they would conclude the Chinese Exclusion Act because the Chinese were being treated poorly. After the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed, there were still a tiny amount of immigrants in the United States due to an exception to the Chinese restriction. The immigrants were granted entry to the U.S., even if they had any relatives who were American citizens. However, some immigrants found a way around the Exclusion Act. They would fake their American relatives. This is called the paper sons or paper daughters. They entered falsified papers saying that they would have family members living in the U.S. We didn't want to come in illegally, but we were forced to because of the immigration laws. They particularly picked on the Chinese. If we told the truth, it didn't work, so we had to take the crooked path, said Ted Chan in a 1977 interview. Another event that happened was the Rock Springs Massacre, when 22 white miners attacked Chinese miners and killed approximately 28 of them. They also set fires to homes after that. They did this because the Chinese miners were hired over the white miners. This event took place in Rock Springs on September 2nd, 1885. The Chinese Exclusion Act was expired in 1892, but the U.S. Congress made another act that extended the Chinese Exclusion Act for another 10 years in the form of the Geary Act. Following World War II, the act had a 10-year moratorium because it jeopardized the good order of certain localities. Why do they not legislate against Swedes, Germans, Italians, Turks, and others? Young Hen, a Chinese poultry dealer in San Francisco, asked in 1892. There are no strings on those other people. For reasons, you people persist in pestering the Chinese men, says Young Hen, 1892. The act also allowed Chinese residents already in America to register and obtain a certificate of residence. They were given 1 year to accomplish that. Without one, he or she faced deportation or a year of hard labor and then deportation. The Chinese hated the law, many refusing to register, so they protested. A group called the Six Companies helped the Chinese protest. They organized a campaign of residence for many Chinese immigrants in the U.S. in September 1892. They were very successful. In 1902, Chinese immigration was made permanently illegal. They were the first immigrants group excluded from America, making the first group to have to sneak their way into the country. They would disguise themselves as Mexicans, painting their faces brown and learning a bit of Spanish. Or they would work in Cuba as ship members in order to get to America. On December 17, 1943, the Magnuson Act was put into law, repealing the Geary Act. However, the act only allowed 105 Chinese immigrants in the country, according to a quota by the Immigration Act of 1924, but did allow the Chinese already in the U.S. to become citizens for the first time ever. In 1990, the Immigration Act of 1990 was made official. The act provided the most comprehensive change in legal immigration. The act said that visas for any single foreign state in these categories, family-based, employment-based, and diversity visas, may not exceed 7% of the total available. The main reasons this act was made was to change the previous United States immigration law that did not grant visas to immigrants from certain countries. This act increased the number of legal immigrants from 500,000 to 700,000. This act also introduced a lottery system that would assign visas to random immigrants. The Chinese Exclusion Act affects us today by starting illegal immigration for immigrants to enter America. For example, the Mexicans and Muslims. The Chinese Exclusion Act was passed to stop the conflict of Chinese immigrants overflowing jobs and to meet the anti-Chinese angry demands. Today, the world is starting to connect with each other more and have better relationships, even if they have a different ethnicity. Friendships today are more mixed in race than the past. For instance, usually where groups of only white kids or Mexicans together. People are starting to interact with and understand each other better by